A crumpled check trembled in Jamal's hands, his eyes wide with disbelief. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the life-changing numbers before him. How did a simple act of kindness lead to this moment? Let's rewind, just 24 hours, to uncover the unexpected chain of events that brought a struggling black teen and a mysterious elderly woman together. As we reflect on this story, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more daily stories that need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Jamal's footsteps echoed on the quiet suburban sidewalk as he made his way home from his part-time job. The weight of his backpack, filled with textbooks and homework, pressed against his shoulders. As he rounded the corner, he spotted an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags, her hands shaking as she tried to manage the load. Jamal glanced at his watch, torn between his packed schedule and the nagging feeling that he should help. The neighborhood wasn't exactly known for its warm welcome to young black men, but as the woman stumbled slightly, Jamal's concerns evaporated. He quickened his pace, approaching her with a tentative smile. "Would you like some help with those bags?" The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her face. She paused, studying Jamal for a moment before her expression softened into a grateful smile. "Oh, thank you, young man. That would be wonderful." As Jamal took the heaviest bags, he introduced himself. The woman's eyes crinkled warmly as she replied, "I'm Eleanor Dawson. I live just down the block." They walked together, chatting easily. Jamal learned that Mrs. Eleanor was a retired teacher, and he found himself sharing his dreams of college and becoming an engineer. Mrs. Eleanor asked thoughtful questions about his studies and aspirations, her interest evident in her attentive gaze. As they approached her house, Mrs. Eleanor's tone shifted slightly. "You know, Jamal, your kindness reminds me of some very special people I knew long ago. People who believed in making a difference, no matter how small the act." Jamal's curiosity piqued. There was something in Mrs. Eleanor's voice, a hint of a deeper story. But before he could ask, they reached her front porch. Mrs. Eleanor insisted on offering him a cold drink for his troubles, and Jamal found himself following her inside. The interior of Mrs. Eleanor's home revealed glimpses of history. Framed photographs on the walls showed scenes of civil rights, marches, and community gatherings. Jamal's eyes widened as he took it all in, questions forming on the tip of his tongue. Mrs. Eleanor noticed his interest. "Those are from another lifetime, it seems. My husband and I, we did what we could to support the cause. Nothing heroic, mind you, just ordinary people trying to do the right thing." As Jamal sipped his lemonade, Mrs. Eleanor shared a few stories from those turbulent times. Her eyes shone with a mixture of pride and sadness, and Jamal found himself deeply moved by her quiet strength. All too soon, Jamal realized he needed to head home. As he said goodbye, Mrs. Eleanor squeezed his hand warmly. "Thank you again, Jamal. You've brightened an old woman's day more than you know." Walking home, Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions. He was running even later now, but somehow that didn't seem to matter as much. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Little did he know that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would change the course of his life. Mrs. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of an old photograph, her mind drifting to a time when small acts of kindness sparked monumental change. How would the echoes of her past influence the path she was about to set in motion? Settling into her favorite armchair, Mrs. Eleanor gazed at the walls of her study, adorned with faded photographs and yellowed letters. Each image told a story of her involvement in civil rights efforts, from organizing community meetings to participating in peaceful protests. As a former teacher, she had witnessed firsthand the power of education to shape young minds and challenge societal norms. Her late husband's face smiled at her from a frame on her desk, his eyes twinkling with determination. Thomas had been her partner in their shared commitment to equality. Together, they had worked tirelessly, supporting desegregation efforts and providing scholarships to marginalized students. Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing the memories to wash over her. She remembered the hushed conversations in school hallways, planning how to integrate their classrooms without drawing too much attention. The late nights spent reviewing applications for their small scholarship fund, searching for students with potential who just needed a chance. A tear slipped down her cheek as she recalled the joy on the faces of those students as they received their acceptance letters to college. She and Thomas had never sought recognition, content in the knowledge that they were making a difference, one life at a time. Opening her eyes, Mrs. Eleanor's gaze fell on a small notepad where she had jotted down details about Jamal. His kindness had stirred something deep within her, reminding her of the values she and Thomas had held dear. His determination to pursue engineering, despite obstacles, resonated with her experiences mentoring students years ago. As she sat there, surrounded by the echoes of her past, a plan began to take shape in her mind. The scholarship fund she and Thomas had established still existed, largely forgotten and untouched for years. Perhaps it was time to breathe new life into their old dream, using it to support students like Jamal. Mrs. Eleanor's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that this chance encounter with Jamal was an opportunity to honor Thomas's memory and continue their shared legacy. With renewed energy, she stood and made her way to her desk. Picking up a pen, Mrs. Eleanor began to write, outlining her intentions and the steps she would need to take. As the words flowed onto the paper, she felt a sense of rightness, as if all the threads of her life were coming together in this moment. She paused, looking once more at Thomas's photograph. "We're not done yet, my love," she whispered, a smile playing on her lips. "There's still work to be done." The next day, an unexpected letter disrupted Jamal's ordinary routine. He examined the thick, cream-colored envelope, noting the elegant handwriting. What could Mrs. Eleanor want from him? Jamal's mother watched as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation requesting Jamal and his family's company for afternoon tea at Mrs. Eleanor's home. Jamal read the words aloud, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Tea? With that nice lady you helped?" his mother asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Jamal nodded slowly, still processing the invitation. That evening, the family discussed the unusual invitation over dinner. Jamal's father expressed concerns about the rarity of interracial social gatherings in their community, while his mother wondered about Mrs. Eleanor's motives. Jamal felt conflicted, recalling the warmth of his brief encounter with Mrs. Eleanor, but anxious about the unfamiliar social situation. After weighing their options, the family decided to accept, seeing it as a chance to bridge generational and cultural gaps. On the day of the visit, Jamal adjusted his collar nervously as they approached Mrs. Eleanor's house. His mother squeezed his hand reassuringly. Mrs. Eleanor greeted them with a warm smile, instantly easing some of their tension. She led them into a sunlit sitting room where a table was set with delicate china and freshly baked scones. The conversation began hesitantly, but gradually relaxed as they found common ground, discussing education and community. Mrs. Eleanor showed genuine interest in Jamal's studies and aspirations. As they sipped tea, Mrs. Eleanor's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. That picture, she began reflectively, was taken during a time when simple acts of kindness could spark monumental change. Intrigued, Jamal leaned forward. Mrs. Eleanor shared stories of her involvement in the civil rights movement, teaching in newly integrated classrooms, and supporting students facing tremendous challenges. Her words brought to life the struggles and triumphs of a generation past, filling the room with the echoes of history. As Mrs. Eleanor's stories unfolded, Jamal sensed a shift in the atmosphere. There was a purpose in her voice, a glimmer in her eye hinting at something more. She paused, setting down her teacup. "But you know," she said, meeting Jamal's gaze, "the reason I invited you here today goes beyond sharing old memories." As Mrs. Eleanor's gaze locked with Jamal's, the air in the room crackled with anticipation. Mrs. Eleanor rose and made her way to an antique writing desk in the corner. Jamal's parents exchanged a curious glance, while Jamal felt his heart begin to race. Mrs. Eleanor retrieved an envelope from the desk drawer and turned to face them. "Jamal," she began, her voice soft but clear, "your act of kindness stirred something in me. It reminded me of the values my late husband Thomas and I held dear." She paused, her eyes misting over. "We always believed in the power of education to change lives, to open doors that might otherwise remain closed." Mrs. Eleanor steadied herself and continued, "Thomas and I established a scholarship fund years ago, but it's been dormant for some time. Your kindness inspired me to revive it." She extended the envelope towards Jamal, who accepted it with wide-eyed disbelief. "This scholarship, in Thomas's name, will cover your full tuition for 4 years at any public university in the state. It's meant to alleviate the financial burden so you can focus on your studies and your dreams of becoming an engineer." The magnitude of Mrs. Eleanor's words sank in. Jamal stared at the envelope, unable to fully process what he had just heard. His mother gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes, while his father sat stunned, gripping the arm of the sofa. Inside the envelope was a letter detailing the scholarship and a check for the first year's tuition. The numbers swam before Jamal's eyes as he tried to comprehend their meaning. This was the key to a future he had only dared to dream about. Tears streamed down Jamal's face as the reality of the moment hit him. He looked up at Mrs. Eleanor, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say. This is everything." Mrs. Eleanor smiled gently, her own eyes glistening. "You don't need to say anything, dear. Your actions spoke volumes. This is our way of paying it forward, of ensuring that kindness and potential are nurtured." The room erupted into a flurry of emotion. Jamal's parents embraced him, their tears mingling with laughter and words of gratitude. Mrs. Eleanor found herself enveloped in a warm hug from Jamal's mother. The two women connected by an understanding that transcended age and background. As the initial shock subsided, the air in the room felt charged with possibility. For Jamal, the weight of financial worry lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of responsibility and determination. He knew that this gift would change not just his life, but potentially the lives of those he could help in the future. Jamal sat in quiet reflection, the scholarship in his hands a tangible symbol of his future. His mind raced with possibilities, no longer constrained by financial worries. Mrs. Eleanor watched him from across the room, recognizing the spark of determination she had witnessed in countless students over the years. Jamal's parents, still overcome with emotion, began to discuss plans for his college journey. Their voices, filled with newfound hope, blended with the soft clink of teacups. In this moment, the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to crumble, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and connection. As they prepared to leave, Jamal turned to Mrs. Eleanor. "I promise to make the most of this opportunity," he said, his voice steady with resolve. Mrs. Eleanor nodded, knowing that the impact of this day would extend far beyond the walls of her home. The air hung heavy with the weight of unspoken gratitude and the promise of futures transformed. Join our community of people who believe in justice, empathy, and powerful storytelling. By subscribing, you're not just watching, you're part of a movement that values real stories and change. Add us to your daily routine and make every story count. Subscribe and join us each day for stories that make an impact.